Coming up, will Cam Thomas's free agency end with him back in a Nets uniform next season? I'll answer that question coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I'm Eric Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. Thank you for making me your first listen of the day. This show is 100% free on all those great platforms. And on today's episode, I'm going to be previewing Cam Thomas's free agency, detailing why the Nets are in a great position to retain him, giving predictions for his deal, and assessing his long-term future with Brooklyn. But to start off the show, really want to touch on why the Nets are in such a good position to retain Cam Thomas on a team-friendly deal, because Thomas's free agency is going to be among the top storylines for the Nets this offseason. He is a restricted free agent, obviously, and there's been, big decisions in free agencies the last few offseasons for the Nets, whether it was Cam Johnson, whether it was Nick Claxton last summer, but this one seems to have a little less suspense and a little less, questions tied to it. And that is all tied to the fact that if you're looking around the league at free agency and who controls the landscape of free agency, it's the Nets. The Nets are the only team with significant cap space this summer. So that is obviously going to limit their competition for Cam on the open market. And in addition to that, as a restricted free agent, the Nets would be able to match any offer made to Cam. But because nobody else has cap space, teams looking to make an offer to Cam this summer are going to be limited to the taxpayer or the non-taxpayer mid-level exception, which is $14 million. And the expectation is that Cam's contract is going to come in more than that. So if teams can only offer him $14 million, the Nets don't really have any competition, and they really don't have to pay him much more than that. I think he will get more than that, but there's just less, questions about who's going to come in and swoop in and, give an offer to Cam Thomas to try to pry him away from the Nets. There's questions like that for other teams, and the Nets are the team that other teams will potentially be worried about, whether you're talking about a Jonathan Kuminga or a Quentin Grimes or whatever restricted free agent you want to talk about. The Nets are that team. There is no other team, to kind of pressure the Nets into giving Thomas more than they're comfortable with. So that puts them in a really great position, to retain Thomas on a team-friendly deal, as I said. And if we're talking about what Thomas's next contract is going to look like, what the value of it's going to be, this has been a really tough question to answer for the last year and a half, since Cam really broke into the Nets rotation and emerged as their leading scorer, obviously flashed his all-world scoring ability. Some of the holes in his game obviously were on full display as well, and that has led to more polarizing discourse about Cam Thomas, about who he is as a player, about what he's worth. And it's a question that you really haven't been able to get a handle on, leading up to this free agency. There are people, when you ask, the answers are all over the spectrum. There's a lot of NBA people who are very in the know who you've asked, last year leading up to this season. And they'd said, I honestly have no idea what he's going to get paid, what he's worth, because there just hadn't been the sample size of him playing. There's a little bit more of a sample size now. Obviously, he's battled injuries, only played in 25 games this past season, had 3 hamstring injuries, but there is a little bit more of an understanding of what he can do, the things that, who he is as a player, where he needs to improve. So I think that has led to a little bit more clarity about what he could get. And Bobby Marks, former Nets executive, and now obviously at ESPN, does a great job there, has been doing his offseason guides for each team. And he touched on this yesterday, talking about Cam as part of the Nets offseason. And he referenced Anthony Simons' contract, which is 4 years, $100 million with the Portland Trailblazers, as a potential benchmark for Thomas's next deal. And I really thought that was interesting, because when you look at Thomas and you look at, Anthony Simons, obviously they're very different players. They have different skill sets, both guards, but both did, post similar stat lines over their ages 22 and 23 seasons as high-volume ball handlers on bad teams. And you're looking at Cam's stats over the last 2 seasons. Cam was at 23 points per game, 3 assists, 2 turnovers, 44, 36, 86 splits. Simons, during his age 22 and 23 seasons, was at 19 points per game, 4 assists, 2 turnovers, 45, 39, 89 splits. So they're really close to each other in terms of the production, both playing for bad teams, both having lead ball handler roles. And people I've spoken to about Thomas's next deal have said that they think that it falls in the 20 to 25 million range annually. So that would be, in line with what Marks is saying and in line with those projections. And a lot of people, I think, might, it's really interesting when you're talking about the Cam Thomas discourse, because there's some people, who are fans of other teams, NBA people who might hear, Cam getting that much money and they might say, that's crazy to give this guy $20 to $25 million. There might be a lot of Nets fans who say, this guy is worth more than that. I wouldn't be surprised if he got a Jalen Green-esque deal, which is over $30 million per year. So the discourse and the conversation surrounding Cam really just falls all over the spectrum, and that's what makes him such an interesting player. But I do think that the Nets are in a good position to retain him, as I said, and I also think that there's a very realistic possibility where he is getting that money. That seems like the range that it's going to fall in. And I think the reason that Cam has had such a strong effect on a large segment of the Nets fan base, obviously the Nets haven't been the most exciting team the last 2 seasons. There's been a lot of turnover. There's been a lot of down times, but Cam has been that guy who's, provided those flashes of scoring brilliance, those marquee moments, those explosion nights, those big shots, all the excitement that you do want to see as an NBA fan and as a basketball viewer. And also I think people are just attracted to the confidence that he has as a player, the swagger he plays with. What you're going to get from him in terms of the mindset, in terms of how he attacks the game, in terms of how he feels about himself. And while, that could be to his detriment sometimes, it could lead to questions about areas of weaknesses for him and all those things. I do think it's very attractive as an NBA fan. And I do think it's put him in a position while, the jury's still out on what he's going to be long-term in the NBA, where he's going to be in a rotation. It's put him in a position where he's produced, he's worked his way into a rotation, he's developed into a leading scorer of an NBA team, and he's in line to get a very significant payday this offseason. So I said, 20 to 25 million. That's what I've been hearing from a lot of people in terms of the range of annual salary for Cam's deal. That would be in line with what Bobby Marks said. The next question is, will this be a long-term deal or a short-term deal? I'll break down what I feel is the most likely length and structure of Thomas's deal coming up next. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Let's talk about something that doesn't get talked about enough: men's mental health. There's this pressure to always keep it together, to perform, provide, never show weakness. But the truth is, real strength comes from opening up and taking care of your mental well-being. Every year, 6 million men in the U.S. experience depression, and many go undiagnosed. But talking to someone, a friend, a loved one, or a therapist can make a huge difference. Therapy isn't just for crisis moments. It's great for learning how to set boundaries, build healthy coping tools, and be the best version of yourself. With over 35,000 licensed professionals, BetterHelp makes it easy to find a therapist who understands you. You can connect from anywhere, switch therapists at any time, and fit sessions into your schedule with just a click. At the largest online therapy provider in the world, BetterHelp can provide access to mental health professionals with a diverse variety of expertise. Talk it out with BetterHelp. Our listeners get 10% off their first month at BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. All right, coming out of the break, we're talking about Cam Thomas's next contract and his free agency and what that deal could potentially look like for the Nets. Will it be a long-term deal? Will it be a short-term deal? I said, and I've heard from people, and Bobby Marks said, in my first segment, I was talking about him getting potentially 20 to 25 million annually. I obviously think the length of the deal will impact the average annual value as it does in contract negotiations. But I think it's interesting when you're talking about what will the structure of Cam's deal long-term versus short-term, how the Nets front-load it or back-load it. I think it would be interesting and telling to look at Cam Johnson and Nick Claxton's contracts, because they are the most recent examples of the Nets negotiating with significant players, players of this caliber, and specifically Claxton's contract, because when the Nets did Claxton's contract last summer, they front-loaded it. They structured it in a way that was advantageous to where they were in their timeline and where they were in their rebuild. And when I say front-load, they paid out the bulk of the deal in years that they are still rebuilding. They paid it out last season. They paid Nick the majority, the highest annual hit by far was in the first year of the deal. And Nick got a 4-year, $97 million contract. And when you look at the way that the Nets structured it, Claxton is making a lot in the first 2 years, and on the back end, it could look a lot more attractive because he's going to be making 13.6% of the salary cap in the third year of his deal, and he's going to be making 11.2% in the last year. It's descending all the way down there. And if Nick, while he had a down year last year, if he can continue to develop and show some of the flashes that he's shown, as a defensive guy, as a perimeter defender, rim protector, as a lob threat, all of those things, that's going to be, that's role player money. Like, that's going to be a good value contract for a player of his caliber if he continues to develop into the latter half of that deal. So I've wondered, would the Nets follow a similar path for Cam's deal, for Cam Thomas's deal? If they commit to building through the draft, which is a big question, because I talked on my last episode about the possibility of a Giannis Antetokounmpo trade. Would the Nets go down that path? And it seems like it's really either going down that path and going after Giannis, or building through the draft, leaning into the tank, extending this rebuild timeline. If they go the latter route and they build through the draft, they're not going to be very good this coming season or next, probably. They're going to be building through the draft, developing young players. So in Cam's regard, they can use those years to his advantage, to their advantage. They can use those to pay him the bulk of the deal, as they did with Nick Claxton. And if they're going to go the long-term route with Cam, I think that that's the way that they will definitely structure this, to give them some benefit on the back end. Because if the Nets have Cam making between 11 and 14% of the salary cap, as Nick is in the final 2 years of his deal, that could be a very good value if he continues to develop. If he continues to obviously show the scoring on decent efficiency like he has, if he's able to develop his playmaking game, if he's able to be, somewhat not of a huge negative defensively, he's going to be a player that will be worth that role player level money that you would be paying him. So all of those are questions. And the question obviously is going to be for the Nets, do they want to lock themselves into a long-term commitment like that, where the back end could look more attractive, or are they still just completely evaluating and they're more comfortable giving Thomas a short-term deal, where they would probably maybe be a little bit more money, maybe be a little bit more bloated, but they wouldn't have that money tied up on their books long-term. So that's really interesting. When you look at, whether they would give a long-term deal, and, I obviously was alluding to Nick Claxton, but there is a question of the difference between Claxton and Thomas's play archetypes, their positions, and, how they're valued as, role player level players, because the Nets were comfortable giving Claxton that deal. They thought the back end of that deal would be of good value. I don't think that's surprising after, the season that he had in 2022-23, the flashes he showed in the year before that, lend them confidence. Okay, this guy is going to be a good, probably starting caliber center in the NBA. So the back end of that contract, if we can get him between 11 and 14% of the salary cap, as they did, that's going to be a very good value. It's a little bit different in Thomas's regard, because Thomas, like Claxton, it's always clear he's a center. He wasn't going to be a star on a team. He's not going to be, a lead ball handler or anything along those lines, a lead scorer. He was locked into that role player conversation. With Cam, the best things that he do are on the ball. The best things that he does is his scoring. So, that leads you to the conundrum that Cam, when you're evaluating Cam's game, that you find yourself in, where, if he's not going to be that lead guy, that star level guy on a playoff level team, is he going to be viewed valuably around the league, as a role player type of guy? And that's the question if the Nets lock him into a long-term deal, where the back end of that contract, is it valuable for them in a role player archetype? Is it valuable to other teams that they potentially want to move it? How do teams view Cam in the role player, conversation versus how they viewed Claxton? And I think it's obvious, as I said, that Claxton was viewed favorably in that regard, and the jury's very much still out on Cam. So that's going to be the question of the Nets. Do they want to lock Cam into a long-term deal? How do they feel he's going to be viewed down the line? How do they feel that contract's going to age? And a lot of that is going to depend on whether Cam is able to round out, those less polished aspects of his game, whether it be playmaking, whether it be defense, any of those things that would allow him to fit more in a role player type archetype. And I'm going to talk about that on the last segment. But before that, talking about whether it's going to be a long-term or a short-term deal, it's also important to note, what does Thomas's representation push for? Because Thomas might not want to lock himself into a long-term deal. I think while it would sound great to get something, along the lines of what Claxton got, 4 years, $100 million, it's a life-changing payday. You're locking yourself in long-term, giving yourself that security. But Cam might not want to lock himself that much in long-term, because there's more teams that are going to have cap space before that in the near future. And he's in a position right now where there's no other teams to bid for him, as I outlined at the beginning of this show. So, Cam's not lacking any confidence. Like, that's the question. I think a lot of people would see this situation and say, you got to take the long-term deal. You got to lock yourself in on that money. That's a safe play. And I don't disagree. But Cam, views himself as a star level player. And if he views himself in that ilk, like when I asked Cam after his season-ending hamstring injury, if he thinks that he's done enough to solidify a long-term role for himself with the Nets, which I thought was a fair question because it's a question amongst the fan base. It's a question amongst a lot of, NBA people that you'll talk to. He said that he felt that when he's played, that he's been one of the best guards in the league. So I think that tells you, obviously, how he views himself, the confidence he has, which obviously shows with the way that he plays the game. And I think that it's only logical that that confidence would, move over to how he's viewing himself contractually and his ability to perform well and give himself more earning potential if he does take a short-term deal. So the long-term versus short-term, question is going to be interesting. I've said on previous podcasts that I think it's going to be a short-term deal. I think that, that might make the most sense for the Nets in terms of, them being comfortable, what they're comfortable with, them not tying up long-term money on their books. It might also make the most sense for Cam in terms of him trying to re-enter free agency in the not-so-distant future, give himself a runway to earn more money down the line, and certainly on this next contract. So both of those are going to be really interesting conversations, and we'll see how that shakes out. But coming up next, Cam Thomas's NBA role should gain some clarity during his next contract. I'll tell you whether or not I feel he'll be a long-term piece for the Nets. But before that, want to tell you about our friends at Open Phone. If you're running a business, you know that every missed call is money left on the table. Think about the last time you had an urgent need, maybe for a plumber or a service provider. If the first person didn't answer, did you wait? Probably not. You moved on. That's why you need Open Phone. Open Phone is the #1 business phone system built to streamline and scale your customer communications, all from an app on your phone or computer. Open Phone lets you manage business calls and texts from a single app. The shared inbox feature is a game changer. Your team can jump into any conversation instantly without missing a beat, and their AI agent handles after-hours calls, answers common questions, and captures leads so you never miss a customer. OpenPhone is offering my listeners 20% off their first 6 months at openphone.com/LockedOnNBA. That's OPENPHONE.com/LockedOnNBA. And if you have existing numbers with another service, OpenPhone will move them over at no extra charge. OpenPhone. No missed calls, no missed customers. Coming back from the break, closing out today's Locked On Nets episode, talking about Cam Thomas's NBA future, and more importantly, will he be a long-term piece for the Nets? It's been an interesting question over the last 3 seasons. Obviously, Cam showing elite flashes, but the lack of playing time, that he had early on in his Nets tenure really was divisive amongst the fan base. And I think that it's important to note that in this conversation about Cam, in this conversation about how the Nets view him, because obviously I don't think it was all that surprising that Cam during his first couple seasons, wasn't playing. The Nets were trying to push for a title. They had KD, Kyrie. They really had a need for, more supporting 3-and-D level players around those guys, as opposed to a young guy like Cam who had a score first mentality. But I've said, and I'll continue to say, that I think it was notable after the Nets traded Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving during that 2022-23 season at the deadline and brought in guys like Mikal Bridges, like Spencer Dinwiddie, Dorian Finney-Smith, Cam Johnson. They desperately needed scoring during the second half of that season, and they were trying to win. They got to a playoff series against the Philadelphia 76ers. But during the second half of that season, after those KD and Kyrie trades, Cam was still glued to the bench. Cam was not playing. Obviously, I think, Jacques Vaughn was the coach then. I think he played a significant role in that decision, or he did make that decision, it seemed like. I asked Jacques a lot of questions about why Cam wasn't playing. I think he was very forthcoming, and, said it politely and in a politically correct manner, but did allude to, the shoot first mindset. We have to make other players better. There's, a defense aspect of it, all of those things. But I did think during those points, during the second half of that season, that Cam should have been playing. I was shocked that he wasn't. And I did think at the time that it definitely said something about how the front office was viewing him and how they did view him. Because if they viewed him very favorably, I thought at the time, I thought he would have been playing. I don't see how you could bury him on the bench when a team, needed scoring during the second half of that year. And despite that, this guy who was definitely the most talented scorer on the team, I don't think it was questionable, was buried on the bench. So that has, the last couple seasons have started to kind of change the way that maybe you could view that, because obviously he got into the rotation under Jacques Vaughn, then Jacques Vaughn gets fired. Then he emerged as the team's leading scorer during the second half of the last season. And then this year, while he didn't play much, He was a starter. He was unquestionably the leading scorer, the lead offensive guy of the team. None of that was up for debate. But at this point, with the Nets going to this rebuild, they didn't really have too much of a choice. Obviously, Cam was going to play. Obviously, he was going to get a ton of touches. There's nobody else on the team that could really score at a high level like that last year, especially after they moved Dennis Schroeder, early on in the year. So I think how the Nets, how their reluctance to put him into the rotation during that season, their 22-23 season, and before that, I definitely think it's noteworthy with, assessing how high they could potentially be on him long term. Could that have changed over this last season and a half? Unquestionably, it could have changed, but I definitely think it's noteworthy. And if we're talking about, if Cam's going to be a long-term piece for the Nets or what his role is in the NBA moving forward, I think it's important to, point out obviously his strengths and his weaknesses, but I think I've done a decent job of throughout this podcast of, strengths as a scorer, deficiencies, areas he needs to get better as a playmaker and defender. But I think it's also important to look at what we've seen in these playoffs. Look at the type of basketball that's being played, especially in these conference finals. Look at the starting guards who are playing during these conference finals. You obviously have two types of starting guards. You have the lead guys, the guys who are the lead ball handlers, the offensive engines. That's SGA with the Thunder, Halliburton with the Pacers, Brunson with the Knicks, and Edwards with the Minnesota Timberwolves. All elite level scorers who can distribute the ball at a good, if not an elite level. And, there's going to be a question of whether Cam can get to that level. That's the first type of guard playing in these playoffs. You look at the second type of guard, it's kind of the second fiddle guy, the complementary guy. It's, Andrew Nembhard. It's Mikal Bridges. It's Lou Dort. It's Mike Conley. These are guys who play defense, are high-level decision makers, are high-level feel players. I think maybe Nets fans will have some quips about Bridges and my assessment there after what we just saw in the playoffs and after the trade. But I think obviously he's a good defender. He historically has been a good decision maker. So those are the type of players that are playing that second fiddle position, that complementary guard roles. And, those areas just aren't really Thomas's strong suits right now. I think the shot selection and the playmaking have gotten better over the last year and a half, but there are still moments where Cam's taking very questionable shots, making questionable decisions. And there's a lot of moments where he's missing some easy passes. He's missing some big passes, late in games, down the stretch of last season. There were some big times, some game-winning potential type plays where he's missing some easy looks. So the defense, the shot selection, the playmaking, those complementary aspects aren't necessarily strong suits of Cam's game right now. And that's going to lend to the question of, can he be that complementary guy? So it really is, can Cam fit into either of those molds of guards that I'm talking about that we saw playing in these playoffs? And we're talking about high level number one, lead ball handler type guys, or we're talking about a more complementary type piece who could be a starter next to that lead guy. Is he going to become that caliber of on-ball scorer and decision maker where he's a number one option like SGA, like Brunson, like Ant, like Halliburton? Look, he's 23 years old. He's extremely young. He's got limited reps because he didn't play in his first two seasons. So it's definitely not impossible, but I'd say it's unlikely that Cam reaches that level. I'm not sure how realistic it is that that's in his range of outcomes. And if it's not, is his defense going to allow him to play, a starter role as a complement to a star in these settings, to play that second fiddle backcourt, complementary guard type of role? And as of now, I don't think so, because the defense, I don't know if it's ever going to get to that level. I don't think he'll ever be a plus defender. And to play that type of role, I think you need to be a plus defender, let alone, a bad defender. Like, I definitely think you can't be a bad defender, obviously. So, that and the lack of playmaking, the lack of decision-making early on in this juncture, I think would point to him for these types of playoff caliber rotations being more of a bench guy, being more of that change of pace role. And, that's something that we've heard a lot of people talk about with Cam and allude to as a potential outcome for Cam, whether it be like the sixth man change of pace scorer type of guy off the bench. People have made the Lou Williams comparison. People have said Jamal Crawford. Those guys are different types of players from Cam, but I think they have similarities in terms of their scoring ability, in terms of their ability to be microwave guys who can just come in and cook with the second unit. So that could be a more realistic outcome, a more realistic role for Cam, which I don't think would be a bad, outcome for Cam. I think he could still be extremely valuable in, that type of role. But I think the question is going to be, will he be willing to accept that if he can't reach that level of that star lead guy? Is there going to be a point where he's saying, okay, I'm willing to be a guy who comes off the bench. I'm willing to be more of a complimentary guy. I don't view myself, in that ilk of SGA, of Brunson, of whoever you want to talk about, these star lead guards. And, his confidence, Cam's confidence, and his swagger and all those things I alluded to earlier are part of what makes him great. So I think it's tough. At a certain point, he views himself, he told me, as one of the best guards in the league when he's got an opportunity. If that isn't the reality and he isn't able to get to that level and warrant that lead ball handler type role in a playoff starting five, is he willing to accept the bench role? It's going to be an interesting question. And I definitely think how the Nets view him, what they view of, will he be willing to accept that? What they view of, will he be able to develop all the questions that I posed? That will play into the contract value. And I think more importantly, the contract length, whether they're willing to give Cam a long-term deal, whether they're willing to lock him up on that type of thing where, if they do and they're right, and they think that he'll accept that, they think he can develop out those less polished aspects of his game, that, Nick Claxton type of structure with the front loading of the deal, it could come out being a really good value for Cam on the back end. But that's going to hinge on all the things I've talked about and how the Nets are viewing that and the likelihood of each of those things happening. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out with Cam Thomas. He's, a polarizing player, but an extremely exciting player, a player I've loved covering. And I really appreciate, some of the things, the mindset, the confidence that he approaches the game with. But we'll see whether, he can develop those other areas and, really give himself a solidified role in an NBA rotation long term. I'll have more coverage of that, obviously, leading up to free agency. But that does it for this episode of Locked On Nets. Thank you to all of you for tuning in and supporting the show. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe if you want to help build this channel. I'll be back tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.